Good evening, and welcome to the live discussion program for the film Edo Avant-Garde. I'm William Colburn, director of the Charles Lang Freer House at the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute of Wayne State University. This landmark house in Detroit is a site of great historical significance for Asian art and culture in the United States, as the birthplace of America's National Asian Art Museum in Washington, D.C., through the legacy of art collector Charles Lang Freer. The Freer House is honored to partner with the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Friends of Asian Arts and Cultures, the Friends of the Detroit Film Theater, in celebrating Asian Pacific American Heritage Month by bringing you tonight's special live discussion with film director Linda Hoaglund and Japanese art and architecture expert and Freer House National Advisory Board member, Dr. Yukio Lippit. And now I'm delighted to turn over the proceedings to our neighbors at the Detroit Institute of Arts, Dr. Katherine Kasdorf, Associate Curator of the Arts of Asia and the Islamic World, and Elliot Wilhelm, Curator of Film for the Detroit Film Theater, who will co-host tonight's program.
Thank you, William, and good evening. I'm Elliot Wilhelm, Curator of Film at the Detroit Institute of Arts and Director of the Detroit Film Theater at the DIA. Now, just as a bit of an introduction to Linda Hoaglund, the director of Edo Avant-Garde, she was born and raised in Japan by American parents. She's a bilingual film producer and director, and much of her nonfiction work has focused on Japanese-American relations. Now, if Linda's name sounds familiar to a lot of us cinephiles, it may well be because of her extensive work as a translator. She's provided English language translations for over 200 Japanese films. If you've seen Kurosawa's masterpiece, The Seven Samurai, in its restored Criterion Collection edition, you're familiar with Linda's vibrant and much needed updating of the English subtitles for one of the greatest film epics of all time. Also great, but on a different physical scale, is the film that Linda directed and is here to discuss with us tonight, Edo Avant-Garde. I'll be asking about some of the cinematic aspects of Linda's film, but also here to add detail and insight about the artworks explored in the movie is another very special guest who my colleague, Dr. Katherine Kasdorf, will introduce to you now. Katherine?
Thanks, Elliot, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Yukio Lippit, the Jeffrey T. Chambers and Andrea Okamura Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. And as you've heard from William, he's also a member of the Freer House Board of Advisors. Professor Lippit's knowledge and expertise is wide-ranging, but primarily he specializes in Japanese painting, the subject of the film we're here to discuss tonight. His 2012 book, Painting of the Realm, The Kano House of Painters in 17th Century Japan, was awarded the Charles Rufus Maury Book Award by the College Art Association and the John Whitney Hall Book Prize by the Association of Asian Studies. He's also the author of award-winning essays, such as the article of Modes and Manners in Medieval Japanese Ink Painting, Seishu's Splashed Ink Landscape of 1495, which was awarded the College Art Association's Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize in 2013. Other books include Japanese Zen Buddhism and the Impossible Painting, and also the edited volume, The Artist in Edo, and numerous others that he has authored or co-authored. Yukio has also curated or co-curated a number of exhibitions, including Colorful Realm, Japanese bird and flower paintings by Ito Jakuju, 1716 to 1800, which was at the National Gallery in 2012. Also Sotatsu, Making Waves, co-curated with James Zulak at the Freer Sackler in 2015. And most recently, Painting Edo, Japanese art from the Feinberg collection, co-curated with Rachel Saunders, and currently on view at the Harvard Art Museums. These are just a few of his exhibitions, and they all have beautiful catalogs too, which you can check out. So thank you, Yukio and Linda, for joining us today, and I'll turn things over now to Elliot to get our conversation going.
Thank you so much. Linda, just really watching this film a few times and thinking about the uniqueness of it, I'm wondering if you can remember any specific moment or circumstance that led you to decide to treat this particular art of the Edo period in a documentary. I'm not necessarily talking about an epiphany, but just a moment of inspiration, perhaps.
Before I answer your question, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for inviting to my stream to film with you at the Detroit Institute of Art and also at the Freer House. Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor, and I really appreciate being here. As Elliot mentioned in his introduction of me, I was born and raised in Japan. And my parents were American missionaries who deliberately chose a provincial region to do their missionary work in. And as a result, I was raised in traditional Japanese homes, and I always admired so many things that still, especially in provincial Japan at the time, were still made by hand, including minge or folk crafts. But honestly, Japanese art per se had never really interested me because I had the completely mistaken impression that it was conventional and therefore boring. And if it was boring, it didn't interest me at all. And what happened is that I was visiting Yale to screen one of my previous films called Things Left Behind, related to Hiroshima. And at the time, the Yale University Art Gallery happened to have an exhibit, a large exhibit of folding screens, which are called byobu in Japanese. And one of them was this incredibly dynamic representation of a churning river and boulders and gold clouds. But the depiction was so highly stylized that it seemed like a kind of abstract art to me. And then I looked at the label and it said it had been painted in 1600, and I was so shocked that the phrase Edo Avant-Garde just popped into my head. I had no idea that what we call, I guess, traditional or classical Japanese art could be so unusual and exciting and the opposite of conventional. And so that encounter launched a good 2 years of researching about 30,000 works of art that were online on American Museum collections. And I went through and completely arbitrarily made a selection of about 1,000 works of art that, according to the Linda Hoaglund school, she calls Edo Avant-Garde. Nobody else calls them this. I just want you to know that this is completely made up category that I take full responsibility for. And then I would say out of that, we wound up filming about 200 works. But really the goal of this film was to share. I mean, I know that calling a film a journey is the most overworked cliche in the American language at this point. But it really was, let's call it, Alice fell down a hole or something. I mean, I just slipped into a different arena and found all these amazing paintings, and I wanted to share what I found along the way. So I made the film.
And we're all so grateful that you did. One of the most compelling aspects of the film to me is the variety of viewing contexts and viewing perspectives that we see for Edo period screen paintings. So for instance, we see them in tea houses, in temples, in people's homes, as well as in different types of museum settings. We also see them during different times of day, different types of light, and we see some screens in the very process of being unfolded and set up. We also see people in the film experiencing paintings from different perspectives and bodily positions. I just love that moment when the scholar Sawaragi Noi is seated in front of a screen and he says that he feels like he's looking at the flowers it depicts from an animal's perspective. The film really shows how immersive and dynamic these screens are. So I'm wondering, could you both say a little bit more about some of the different viewing contexts for screen paintings, both historically and in the film? And then Linda, could you also speak to some of your own choices in representing some of the specific contexts to the film's viewers?
Well, certainly, the context for viewing paintings in Edo period Japan is very different from what we assume today. In the Edo period, there was no culture of public exhibition. People viewed paintings in small, discrete groups and mostly private settings. And the display was what can be called occasion specific. So a work was only brought out and unfolded or unrolled for the duration of a specific occasion, usually a social visit, a poetry gathering, maybe a tea ceremony, or a religious ritual on occasion. But it was only brought out for an occasion of maybe a few hours, possibly a few days, and then it would be folded up and put away. And so not every painting was suitable for every occasion. Seasonally, you had you wanted a resonance between the painting and the time of year and so forth. And another thing that's greatly distinguishes Edo period viewing context from our own is that people in the Edo period sat on the floor indoors. The Edo period was a floor-sitting culture. You didn't spend a lot of time indoors standing up. And it was, here, this is a still from the film that I think well captures this practice of viewing paintings from a position on the floor. It was an inconceivable for someone in the Edo period to walk into a room, stand in front of a screen, fold their arms and scratch their chin and look at it like we do today. They were sitting on the floor, and the implications of that for the viewing experience are profound. Your sight line kind of matches roughly the middle of the height of the screen. The screen surface is an immersive visual field that really encompasses the viewer, and I think that's really well captured actually here in this image that we're viewing.
Yes, this was a extremely privileged opportunity. This is actually it's actually an Edo era tea house that was transported from somewhere in the Kyoto area to the MOA museum in Atami. And so the tea house is located on the beautiful grounds of the MOA museum in Atami. And we received unprecedented permission to film one of their folding screens in this tea house. Trust me, it is not an everyday occurrence, and we were so most fortunate. And so, as you can see from the film, and for those of you who haven't had a chance to watch it yet, I hope you'll appreciate it when Sawaragi-san, who is one of the most foremost contemporary art critics and curators in Japan, it was for him a entirely new experience to encounter a folding screen in this manner. Early on in my research, I was fortunate enough to come under the generous advice and good graces of a New York art dealer who showed me a cherry screen in candlelight. He had just sold this screen to a collector, and it is his habit to view it privately at night in candlelight before sending it on its way to its next life with its next collector. And when the lights in his gallery went out and the candlelight and the candles were lit, something in the screen came back to life. I'm not quite sure what it is, but perhaps even in this photograph, you can see how there's a kind of a depth that seems to be apparent in the painting that certainly was not visible under electrical lighting. And once I experienced that singular transformation, filming, this is a still camera we captured this with, but filming a byobu in candlelight with the moving camera kind of became the holy grail of the film. And this was another rare privilege granted by another dealer in Kyoto, Matsumoto Kenjiro. And you can see here he is arraying the rooster screens in a manner that, as Yukio alluded to, you would never see a pair of folding screens exhibited this way in a museum today. But he was trying to recreate the incredibly versatile ways in which byobu can be displayed or exhibited within a private space. And in terms of the there's moments in the film where I deliberately show art handlers setting up the screens. I had, of course, never seen, usually art handlers work behind the scenes before a museum opens their exhibit to the public. So I had never seen art handlers setting up folding screens until we started filming. And I was so fascinated by that they seem to be kind of dancing with the screens. They're so tall and large, and in fact their versatility means that they have a kind of a life of their own, and they could start unfolding themselves. So the art handlers have to be very, very careful, and while they were doing their dance with the screens, they had their backs to the camera, and so I just signaled wordlessly to my cinematographer the kind of the universal keep rolling hand sign. And once we looked at the footage, we decided that it was very compelling visual metaphor for the screens coming back out of storage and back into life in the light and in the presence of human viewers. So we just kept filming it.
So, Linda, following through with that, the way in which your camera seems to discover different perspectives and points of view from which we experience these screens, it gives us the impression that they're living objects. They almost seem like environments. Was that your visual concept from the beginning, or did making the film cause your cinematic style to evolve as you kept shooting these objects?
Well, almost all of the research that I conducted about the artworks was either scans, large and small, on museum websites, or exhibition catalogs. So making the film was very much a process of discovery, and I certainly had never seen Byobu not confined behind glass cases. And it so happened that the first private museum that gave us permission to film Byobu, they gave us permission to, once again, this is an extraordinary privilege, to film it in their conference room with a limited amount of indirect natural light, which you can see here in the gold leaf that is coming back to life with the indirect light. This is actually a national treasure, which can only be exhibited 30 days out of a year. But they gave us this extraordinary permission to film it. And it both, to me, it appeared both as a living object because of the way the gold, you see, gold doesn't tarnish. And so the gold that we see is in fact the same gold that was applied, in this case, I think more, maybe 250 years ago. And so it does seem to come back to life as a living object. And it also does create its own environment because of its size. And also, of course, with certain screens, the innate dynamism. And as you can see, for instance, the white plum blossom on the left is painted to suggest that it's such a massive tree that we can only see one part of its trunk and one part of its branch. And this is it invites the viewer to imagine a much larger tree, a much larger garden, and the painting well beyond the space of the painting. And in terms of a cinematic style, if you can pull up the image of the National Treasure filming, this is us filming the National Treasure. The most important decision my cinematographer and I made was to use a dolly track, which you can see on the floor there, just the parallel rails. And then that's called tracks. And then a dolly, that's a simple platform that we use to put the camera on. And so it can move smoothly right and left. And because we were, for the most part, able to film the folding screens free of glass cases, and also, whenever possible, in natural light, we had initially planned to use the dolly and tracks to film a very, very, very long scroll painting of the cranes, for those of you who've seen the film. But once we used them to film the folding screens, we realized that no one had ever filmed the folding screens with a moving camera, and that the moving footage was revealing artistic techniques and elements that are basically not visible to the human eye or a stable camera. So we never stopped. And to me, for those of you who've seen the film, the footage of the cherry blossom screens in John Weber's private collection is evidence that the artist had actually anticipated the invention of 3D, because at one point the cherry blossom branches seemed to loom out towards the viewer. And we like to think that those particular screens had been lying in wait for 3 centuries to be discovered by Kasamatsu-san's camera.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Linda. So here at the DIA, we also have a collection of Edo period screens. Most of them were acquired during the 1970s and 1980s. And Yukio, since you have some familiarity with our collection, I'm wondering what from our collection do you think resonates most with Edo Avant-Garde and the works that it features?
Yes, well, it's interesting, Linda, we heard Linda mention earlier that she had, thousands of images of works from museums, many of them from North American museums. And it's a fact that there are many rich holdings of Japanese screens in American museums. And the Detroit Institute of Arts has a superb Japanese art collection. I would nominate Suzuki Kiitsu's pair of screens of cranes and reeds as one of my favorites. And if we could actually call that up on the screen, that's a painting by a 19th century artist, Kiitsu, who is part of the Rinpa lineage of Japanese artists. A number of Rinpa artists are featured in Linda's film, including Tawaraya Sotatsu and Ogata Korin. And this school is known for its decorative abstraction, for combining metallic pigments like gold and silver foil with motifs and mineral pigments. Here you see the screens here. And what's remarkable about Kiitsu's work here is that he combines this decorative abstract quality with a remarkable sense of dynamism and movement. And he does so largely by placing the cranes against a blank gold foil background, which requires just an unerring sense of design and composition. And so what effectively happens is that the cranes emanate their own space. You're kind of inferring the space, the natural world, the landscape around them purely by virtue of their placement. It's as if they're giving off this fractal effect, or they're kind of energizing or activating the blank spaces between the motifs to generate this sense of movement. So a work like this, I think, is really captures the wonder of the Edo screen that we heard Linda talk about as an inspiration for the Edo Avant-Garde earlier.
Great, thanks. And of course, the DIA acquired its very first large-scale Japanese folding screen back in 1927, but by then the history of Japanese painting in Detroit was already pretty well established thanks to the collection of Charles Lang Freer. And in fact, his home on Ferry Street in Detroit was only a block from the current location of the DIA. Freer comes into play in the film too during a discussion of the Japanese art market in the early 20th century. And the film features, in fact, a number of works that were once in his collection here in Detroit and are now at the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery of Arts and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C. So Yukio, could you speak to Freer's interest in Edo period painting and the Detroit history of some of the works that we see in the film?
Yes, it's interesting. Detroit indeed really was a center for the collecting and appreciating of Asian and Japanese art at the turn of the century. It's really a portal through which I think, one of the important portals through which Japanese art came to be appreciated in the United States. And certainly it's because of the presence of Freer. He had a fabulous collection. The work you see here, the Matsushima screens by the 17th century Kyoto artist Sotatsu, is one of the major works of his collection. This is a screen that, really for me is kind of combines both painting with, you might say, pattern. It has abstract elements, the mesmerizing patterns of the waves combined with very brush-driven painterly elements, such as the cloud floating in the left-hand corner. It's an interesting work because the same artist is represented by another work in the Freer collection that's also featured in the Edo Avant-Garde. It's a pair of dragons painted entirely in monochrome ink that you see here, which really shows how artists in Edo period Japan had to work in very different media and with very different approaches, very different palettes, and could conjure equally masterful works like you see here. Both of these works, were they in Japanese collections, would certainly be designated national treasures. And what's interesting about Freer is that you mentioned the Freer House. It's truly an important and historic site, and in many ways, it was a kind of something. I think of it as a kind of a laboratory where Freer tried to work out some of the kind of ideal conditions for the viewing and appreciation, the proper kind of context in which to really experience Japanese painting. Now,
great, thanks. Please continue, sorry.
Well, there's a lot more to say about Freer. He was an adherent of kind of a universalist aesthetic. He had this idea that all artistic traditions have the same spiritual roots, and that you could take works from any different tradition and display them together, and they would kind of resonate with one another. And he thought a lot about how to kind of choose and display works from different traditions to bring out this kind of universal, spiritual, harmonic aesthetic. And he even encouraged artists around him to produce works that would resonate with this aesthetic as well. And that's where the house is so fascinating. From the exterior, the house seems like it looks like a kind of a Midwestern shingle style house, but once you enter, it's a completely alternate world. It resonates with the aesthetic that Freer understood Japanese art to bring. The walls were glazed with to approximate the surfaces of Japanese ceramics. He embedded a little bit of a cosmology of Japanese culture in the house by mapping the four seasons under the four cardinal directions. And he got some painter friends of his, like Tryon and Dewing, to produce works, tonalist works that, again, resonated with what he was trying to achieve with this universalist aesthetic. And so you might say that he, inspired by the Edo Avant-Garde, he really tried to intervene in contemporary art making in his own time. And the legacy of that is, I think, embedded wonderfully in the house.
And that's wonderful how Freer was making some of these connections over 100 years ago now. Yeah. So Linda, thinking about this phrase avant-garde that you've very interestingly put in the title of your film, could you say a bit more about your choice to use this phrase avant-garde to describe Edo era painting? Your film certainly makes compelling parallels between Edo paintings and avant-garde paintings from the West, but how do you see Japanese Edo era artists as being avant-garde in their own settings?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the phrase Edo avant-garde literally popped into my head. So it's not like it came out of rigorous scholarly research. It just was my visceral reaction to seeing this incredibly a work of art that was stylized to the point of abstraction from the year 1600. But if we take another closer look at this waves of Matsushima, this is Sotatsu waves of Matsushima. This is just such an to my mind, this is such an extraordinary image that, in a sense, I just felt like to Sotatsu, it must have come somehow from the future. I mean, why do you paint a shadow underneath what may or may not be a peninsula made out of waves? Where does that idea come from? Why does it make sense? To me, it's I do like to use the phrase. I mean, for me, one of the definitions of I look through about 30,000 works of art, and and let's put it this way: they're not all avant-garde by any stretch of the imagination. The very nice New York gallery owner who let me photograph the screen in candlelight. One time he had an exhibit, and a very, very prominent Japanese artist who shall remain anonymous walked in, looked at the folding screen, the very large folding screen that was on exhibit in the gallery, and said in a loud voice, "Wallpaper." I just thought this was the rudest thing anybody could say in front of the gallery owner. I was just flabbergasted. But it did make me realize that some of these large paintings were, in fact, decorative, and they were not a lot more than that. They were decoration. I don't know that we need to call them wallpaper, but they were decoration, and they were not, in my mind, what's avant-garde is what's pushing ahead of its time, pushing ahead of the envelope, and experimenting and innovating, and going to places where other artists may not have gone yet, which I think we can certainly agree that Sotatsu has done so in this painting. And then let's take a look at the Lakma Shohaku. So Soga Shohaku was, he was called an eccentric painter, which I have to say that I personally, as a translator, kisai is the Japanese word, and I really object to the English translation of eccentric. I mean, okay, if Shohaku's eccentric, then so was Picasso. Like, if Picasso gets to be a genius, I think Shohaku also gets to be a genius. But then that's just me with my idiosyncratic, non-art historically correct definitions of words. But then I did get to have the last word on Seven Samurai. So anyway, I'm just trying to bring a little humor to the situation. But for those of you who've seen the film, my reaction at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, when the curator showed me these screens, she said, well, this work, it's imbued, the horses are imbued with the artist's subjectivity. And I say, but isn't art that expresses the subjectivity of the artist considered modern? And I seem to have caught her a little bit off guard, because she says to me, well, I think modern has caught up to Japanese art. And
that's a great moment in the film.
I fell off my chair because, many curators and scholars tend to be a little bit more conservative in their or guarded in their assessment. And when she said, modern has caught up to Japanese art, well, in a way, I rest my case, right? If that isn't Edo Avant-Garde, then I don't know. But then I would also talk about dragons and clouds here. If you look at the details of these folding screens in the film, which I encourage you to do, it's kind of insanity that he could have the kind of virtuoso technique to use the tarashikomi technique, which is wet on wet ink, and you leave the final resolution of the two different types of ink to kind of nature or a kind of alchemy, and to have this is another, to me, a kind of a miracle, even though the theme seems to be very traditional in terms of dragons and clouds. They also have a sense of humor about them, with these two dragons facing off, but there's something, it's very attitudinal with these dragons. I mean, they're like you. I mean, they're almost like, yo, what did you just say to me? Kind of. It's very contemporary attitude. Are you really going to get away with that crap? That's how it. I mean, that's what it looks like to me. And it also was very helpful As you know, in the film, I was able to interview an amazing priestess who has been up at Hiezan in Kyoto in the mists for 35 years. She used to be a copyist, copying national treasures of Buddhist paintings. And you don't get to copy national treasures unless you're like one of the greatest artists in Japan. Yeah. And then she said, after about 5 years, I just decided I want to go be with Buddha. So she left that career behind and she went up into a mountain and has been, cleaning floors and praying up there for 35 years. And when I first was introduced to her through a dear friend, I said, oh, the amazing Dragons and Clouds by Sotatsu. And she said, no, it was a national treasure of Thunder God, Wind God, Thunder God, actually, which is a national treasure in Japan. And she said to me, oh, Linda-san, I think Sotatsu, I think he met the Wind God and the Thunder God. I think he did. And once again, I fell off my chair because there's basically nobody. I mean, if Yukio said that, they would laugh him out of Harvard. I mean, there's nobody in the world who can say that except for this extraordinary woman who had been a copyist of national treasures and had devoted her life to serving Buddha. And I was like, you are so in the movie. I got a little distracted, but I'm trying to kind of show you the process of discovery that went into making the film. Here we are, if we can see the picture of the crew at the Freer Sackler. Here's the crew very happy to be in front of the Dragons and Clouds, of course, without electrical lighting. And, the James Ulack and the Freer was so incredibly welcoming of our crew that we were able to simply film it in the empty gallery so that we have these beautiful painted walls, the elevated height from which to, yes. And here's James Ulack, who also, by the way, when I first emailed him about my thesis in Edo Avant-Garde and wanting to make the film, he literally emailed me back in 5 minutes and said, I've just been preparing the Sotatsu exhibit catalog and I couldn't agree more. How can I help you? And that, and having Yukio Lippit sign on very early on as my film's advisor and write a tremendously humbling letter of recommendation really made all the difference. But I just want to point out that it was James Ulack who compared Sotatsu to Picasso. So once again, I'm going to lean on people like James Ulack and the LACMA curator to help make my case about Edo Avant-Garde.
That's great. Well, one of the things I love about your film is the invitation for viewers to make their own connections. But Yukio, I'm interested in your response to this question too, about how might we consider the artists in Linda's film to have been considered avant-garde in their own contexts?
Yes. Well, it's the Edo Avant-Garde is a great title. What I love about it is that it should make no sense whatsoever. Historically, the avant-garde is a term, it's a military term, right? It's applied in the 19th century to a group of artists that break away from the academy in European context, the French Academy. And so applying it to the Edo period where you have no academy and a completely different set of social historical circumstances for artists should make no sense. But what the term avant-garde captures is this idea that even a slight shift in cultural perspective, an introduction to a different cultural aesthetic can lead you to appreciate what for you in an artwork is a transgression of artistic norms, of conventions that you or the visual culture in which you're immersed are used to. And so I think that's what's captured in the wonder with which the camera engages these different screens. Now there are all kinds of works that are treated in the film. And some works are truly innovative in their own times. They really kind of pursue a different artistic pathway, introduce new practices from what came before. And there are other works that are simply conventional to the Edo period. They take techniques that have been used, kinds of approaches, subject matter, continue artistic practices that are well trodden, but they're radically new when they're introduced to different audiences and in different eras. And that's what's interesting about the film. I mean, Linda spoke a little bit about the future. I think of what's interesting for me, though, is the film doesn't think of innovation in artistry chronologically as a necessary progression into the future. It remaps that onto kind of space and time, and the past can be radically new. So I see avant-garde as kind of capturing this ability of this shifting cultural perspective to conjure up a transgression, an effect of a transgression of artistic norms, of artistic conventions. It does so, I think, wonderfully throughout the film. The works are, radically new and innovative to different audiences and different times and spaces, including our own.
Linda, Yukio's comments just now sort of bring to mind for me some of the requirements, very special requirements that casual viewers might not realize, such as having adequate lighting that may need to be adjusted and refined, but at the same time not exposing the works to hazards that light and heat and physical handling can cause. And that would include the unfolding and adjusting of some of the screens. Can you talk about how you worked with these objects, which are, in a sense, the principal cast of the film?
Yes. Well, there's no question that we could never have made this film without the digital camera, because it requires so much less lighting than a conventional analog film camera. And my gratitude to Sony, who kindly contributed their amazing cutting-edge 4 camera for the film. And that same camera, also, it's a camera that's about, maybe it's the camera itself, the body is about so large. You have to, of course, add lenses, but it also is the first camera that we can use to film in super slow motion, up to 10 times slow motion. So the slow motion that you see of the cranes flying or various birds and scenes was made possible by using that camera. And whenever possible, we did film in natural light. As you can see, the John Weber screens here, the crane screens in John Weber's Fifth Avenue penthouse apartment. Yeah, let's take another look at that. This also gives a clear view of the dolly tracks and the dolly. So here you can see we were able to film in natural light with no artificial light at all. In the case of the LACMA Shohaku filming, they allowed us to film in their president's room, which has glass windows all the way around it. So once again, we didn't need any electrical lighting at all. And then also in the case of the Rooster candlelight screen, this is in the Kyoto Temple. We found an amazing art dealer who gave us permission, shockingly, to film his incredible folding screen by Maruyama Okyo in candlelight. And this was beyond a rare privilege. And also filming this in candlelight, as you can see, it almost looks like the rooster is leaping or jumping. And so seeing it in candlelight, especially with the moving camera, makes us wonder whether, in a way, these screens displayed at night in candlelight may have been, in fact, akin to a kind of a cinematic experience. But of course, this wasn't possible in most museum settings. So as you can see with the filming at the Freer Sackler photo, you can see here we used a minimal amount of electrical lighting on the floor, always 6 feet away from the screens so as to never damage them, and usually with a kind of a light filter to diffuse the electrical lighting. And thank you also, Elliot, for your insight that the screens are, in a sense, the cast of my film. As you can see from the dolly camera set up here, this is at the Seattle Art Museum. I find all these screens so beautiful and so handsome. And because they're multi-perspective, unlike Western art, which is single point perspective, they look different. They look completely different depending on where you put the camera and how you move it. And I wanted to show off their many features for everyone to see. In my two previous films, Ampo Art X War, about the 1960 democratic uprising in Japan, and Things Left Behind, about the photographs of things left behind by those who perished in Hiroshima, taken by Ishiuchi Miyako, I deliberately featured the art as the central characters of the film in order to tell the story. And this is because that art, at least what I like to call time-stopping art, and this actually goes back to my definition of avant-garde. To me, if you can walk past a painting, it's not stopping you in your tracks or in your time. But if you can't, and you're just rooted to where you are and completely pulled in, captivated by the work, then that's what I call time-stopping art, and that it's definitely one of the features that I would call Edo Avant-Garde in my own completely idiosyncratic definition. And I also feel that viewers are going to find, images of this kind of time-stopping art far more compelling than any kind of recitation or narration of objective facts. A curator can talk until they're blue in the face, but if you look at Sotatsu's Waves at Matsushima or Dragon in Clouds, you're just going to stand there and go, how on earth could that have happened? And to me, that's far more compelling, I think, because you're going to come up with your own reasons. And I think your own reasons are always going to be more persuasive to you than something that a narrator told you. At least that's the way I work. I don't like having reasons hammered into my brain. I prefer to come up with my own understanding, and then that leaves a much more lasting impression. And so I like to give that opportunity to viewers as well.
While we're talking along these lines, I want to keep talking about the images for a little bit. I want to ask you about Kazumatsu Norimichi, a cinematographer, who brings these objects to life on the screen in a kind of a dazzling way. I want to know how your relationship began, and how you talk about his process for achieving the extraordinary sensuality of these images, and most of all, their existence within spaces, the three-dimensionality that you managed to capture in the film. And that touches on the original function of these screens, I guess, that they were more than just works of art to be seen on display in a gallery.
Well, as you mentioned in your kind introduction, Elliot, before I became a director, I actually subtitled 250 Japanese films, and I also then interpreted for directors such as Miyazaki and Oshima and Fukasaku at film festivals. And so the combination of subtitling their films and translating their words when journalists ask them questions, and really smart directors, they don't repeat their answers from Q&A to Q&A. They take the questions to heart and they think while they're answering. And so in that sense, you could say I went to the most exclusive private film school in the history of the universe. And I'm actually not really joking. I learned so much from them. Kurosawa Kiyoshi taught me about, who made Cure, talked about imagining the screen beyond the screen. Anyway, that didn't make any sense. But he taught me, that every moving image is both, it can be fiction, but it's also a documentary record of that time and place. So working with these directors exposed me not only to their unique, cinematic visions, but also to their very philosophical worldviews. I mean, they were really intellectual filmmakers, and I learned so much from them. And one of the directors that I learned so much from was Sakamoto Junji, who's not very well known outside Japan, but he's a brilliant director. And Kasamatsu had filmed more than a dozen of Sakamoto's films, so that's how I got to know him. And for one of my earlier films, I decided to do the color correction where we unify all the color in all of the scenes in a Japanese lab because it's so much cheaper than American labs. I asked Kasamatsu-tan to step in because my cinematographer wasn't available, and he instantly agreed. Then I told him about Edo Avant-Garde, and he said, yes, I'd like to work with you. And the amazing thing is that, you know, I'm not the only Kasamatsu Norimichi fan. Quentin Tarantino actually asked him to film Kill Bill, but somehow he turned down Quentin Tarantino and said yes to me. So what can I say?
Congratulations.
I remain so grateful and so honored. And but it was a very dynamic collaboration because he's used to working. He's actually been nominated 5 times for a Japanese Cinematography Academy Award, and he's won once. But he shot over, I don't know, 50 or 60 feature fiction films. So he's used to working off of a script. And needless to say, I did not have a script. I did have many images of the screens to show him, and I had a sense of a kind of what I wanted to reveal. The other thing that I did want to say is that Kasamatsu is also a huge fan of the older directors that I'd worked with, and we have a shared language. Because I would say, you know, the opening in Samurai Rebellion where he's just cutting from the tiles to the tiles of the roof, and he would go, yes, exactly. And so we were able to talk in images about related to those films in a way that is shorthand for a kind of anyway. Let's take a look at the opening shot of the film here. We're going to look at a short video. We had planned out together that when the monk opened the temple gates, he would push the camera into the garden beyond the gates. But when I saw his camera move in the monitor, I suddenly realized this is the beginning of the film, because there's something about the way he uses the camera. He was pushing the narrative forward, and he was saying, we're inviting you into a different world. We've opened the gates. And there's also something amazing to me about the pacing of the way the monk opens those gates, right? He's been opening those gates for the last 35 years, every morning before it opens to the public. We use the word in Japanese is ochitsuki. There's a kind of he's relaxed into it. There's no rush. There's no hurry. We're taking this in our own time, and his opening of the doors, and then Kasamatsu-san pushing into the garden, and I just knew we had the opening of the film. And so working with him was constantly like that. As you can see, we have the crew at Tofukuji. Yes, here we are. It was a very small crew. We worked together very, very closely. And then let's take a look at part of it is that, well, Kasamatsu-san actually said he likes working with me because he said, Linda, you know exactly what you want, which I guess is a nice way of saying I'm a control freak. But I think that knowing the shots that I wanted in any given situation, like the azalea that you just saw at the end of that opening clip, the super close-up of the chipmunk, the ray of light. I remember saying to him, we took the fast train from Tokyo to Kyoto when we were going to film in Kyoto, and I knew the fall colors were fine, and we took the first train. It was 6 a.m. and I could see while we were on the train, the clouds were moving really fast. And I just said to Kasamatsu-san, I said, today, let's try to just film some light. Let's film some light. And he said, okay, that sounds good. So, you don't just say to a cameraman, oh, we're going to film light today. It's not that easy to film light. But because of the way the clouds and the sun were interacting with the maple leaves at the temple, we got that shot. And I just said, just keep rolling, because a miracle had happened. And, in Japanese, we do say eiga no kamisama, the gods of cinema, and sometimes they're with you and sometimes they're not. And so actually every film crew goes to a Shinto shrine to pray for the blessing of the gods, for their blessing and their mercy to descend upon us. And we did that at the beginning of the film as well.
It worked.
Well, anyway, thank you.
It certainly did work. And as we saw in that clip and in some of these stills, the film is truly effective in creating an immersive experience for the viewer in these long, slow moments where we're simply looking at a painting or at nature without any commentary. And I think during these moments especially, the film's music really enhances the mood. The music is just so well suited to the imagery. For instance, I was blown away by the moment when we're looking at that fabulous crow's painting in the Seattle Art Museum, and then suddenly we hear what sounds like the flapping of wings. So Linda, could you tell us more about the musicians that you worked with and your process in working with them? And I'm also wondering, did the music and the visuals develop alongside one another, or did one step come first in the process?
Well, I'm very, very fortunate. I've been working with two incredibly versatile musicians who are also composers. They're brilliant and they're versatile. And this is my fourth film with them, Satoshi Takeishi and Shoko Nagai. And they're originally from Japan. They live in Brooklyn now. And from Ampo, we've started by me showing them a lookbook of the art and asking them to compose music inspired by the art. And they really seem to enjoy that. And one of the decisions that we made was that for the most part, for Edo era art, we would use instruments that were contemporaneous to Edo Japan. So we mostly limited it to shakuhachi and koto and biwa. But let's go ahead and take a look at the crow clip here so we can hear what Katherine's talking about. So I had asked Satoshi that I wanted to hear somehow the birds or the crows flying, and he said he tried all kinds of different percussion and none of it was working. So finally he just slapped his palms on his thighs and then sped it up and distorted it. So that's what you're hearing. But they're yeah, I'm just so blessed to have these incredibly resourceful, amazing collaborators. And I also, before we come to an end, I do want to take a moment just to credit the still images that you're seeing, not of the film, but for instance of the crew, or any of the production stills were photographed by Takaaki Okada, who is my co-producer and who also was the magician who helped us gain entry into the MOA museum where we filmed the National Treasure in the conference room. So just a shout out to Takaaki as another incredible collaborator.
And looking at that clip, Linda, reminds me of how you juxtapose newly filmed images of the natural world with their representations in the works of art from the Edo period. It's an idea that might have carried a certain amount of risk of cliche had the images not been as brilliantly captured and edited into the fabric of the movie as they are. Can you talk a little about your decision-making process doing that? And was there a point when you decided this is really going to work?
One of the questions that I wanted the film to be responding to is so one thing I haven't said yet is the reason that I chose folding screens and depictions of the natural world, which is, 90% of the art in the film is a depiction of the natural world depicted on a folding screen. And I limited it to that because that is those artworks are most radically different from Western art. And I wanted to make the case that that's part of the Edo Avant-Garde, is that this is so radically different in every way from Western art. And I wanted to contrast that. So what I wanted to try to ascertain and ponder along with my cinematographer was how might the natural world have appeared to these artists? What inspired them? Because it was their experience of the natural world that spurred so many of these innovations. And as Yamashita Sensei, the art historian in the film, helped me to understand, he said they weren't painting just what they saw with their eyes. They were painting what they felt with their hearts. And this also touches on a very open-hearted sense of spirituality in Japan that can be difficult for, especially I think, contemporary Westerners to appreciate without a kind of I don't know, is it too new agey? Is it a little too sickly sweet? It seems a little open-hearted. What? And it was really important to, for instance, we know that Jakuchu, as Yukio tells us in the film, he was painting really as a religious pursuit. He wasn't doing it for money. And that's where his vision comes from. Let's take a look, though, at the iris close-up. When in real life how often in real life do we have the time to focus on the majesty of something like this, a raindrop, lingering on an iris, and to look at the incredible detail that is wholly invented by nature. So we wanted to spend some time, I think, in revering this kind of natural world. And if you look at the photo of the art, here we are capturing that close-up of the azalea at the Arboretum in Harvard. And I know we're running out of time, so I think I'm maybe going to wrap it up there. I hope that was a helpful answer, Elliot.
It was an extremely helpful answer. Exactly what I wanted. But now I want to. Yeah. I'm sorry. I want to jump on to a question for Yukio, which is about the whole idea in which Linda's documentary finds ways to reinforce some of the philosophy and themes in these screens. But there's also a traditional narrative filmmaking style. We call them biopics, in which a film's visual style attempts to emulate the expressiveness of the artist being portrayed. I think of the Japanese filmmaker Kenji Mizoguchi's film from the 40s about Utamaro, the 18th century printmaker. More recently, in another part of the world, the British filmmaker Mike Lee's movie about J.M.W. Turner in the 19th century, in which Turner's color palette was digitally tweaked by the director to suggest a cinematic self-portrait. I wonder, Yukio, about your feelings on narrative films about artists in general, and specifically how the Japanese cinema has used older, more traditional art forms in creating a national cinema.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Elliot. The best films in Japan about artists try to transpose the artistry of the subject into cinematic terms. And there's, I think, a long in Japanese photography and early film, you see so much continuity with the visual traditions of the Edo period. And I think, as we've heard through all of Linda's answers this evening, this really, I think, what her film is doing. There's no single artist that's treated. It's a cohort of really wonderful Edo period paintings from different areas. But I think the experience of viewing them and the experience of the artists in creating them are somehow translated into a filmic language. And just to take one example, there's no, when you're looking at a large screen in Japan, there's no fixed vantage point from which you're supposed to view the screen. As with easel painting in the early modern European tradition, you can see it from one end to the other. You can see it from the middle. It accommodates many different entry points or vantage points, and that's what you see going on in the film, and the film takes great pains to, I think, really showcase the screens under different viewing conditions and different lights. And I should just say here, because I don't think it's been mentioned enough in the commentary on the film, that one of the truly remarkable invisible accomplishments of Linda is simply getting access to all of these works. Access in Japan can be very difficult. A lot of these works are in temples, shrines, private collections, or they're designated national treasures, important cultural properties, and they're not easy of access. They're not supposed to be displayed often. And I think it's a real testament to Linda's, just her biculturalism, her kind of conviction that she was able to convince so many owners of works to share their works for the film. In fact, there's never been a film in which all of these works from around the world have been brought together in this convening. So for me, I think there's a way in which the film, if it's modeling itself on the artistry of any subject, it's a little bit Linda herself, through her conviction and will, just kind of her experience of the paintings is translated into the film that we see, that we're talking about this evening.
Well,
since we're talking about, I'm sorry, go ahead, Linda.
No, you go ahead, Elliot, please.
I wanted to ask you one final question, which I want to ask to every great documentarian, because I want to get their take on it. And so here it is for you too. Frederick Wiseman, who's now 91, is a legendary American documentarian. He likes to point out that all good documentary films tell stories. They have narrative threads, suspense, surprises, drama, and he believes that they cannot possibly be, nor should they strive to be, completely objective. In that light, how would you characterize the narrative heart of Edo Avant-Garde?
Well, I actually, Yukio, you set my answer to this question up beautifully. I actually think that the film, in a way, is a subjective record of Kasamatsu-san and my experience of being in the presence of these magisterial screens. Because we didn't know until we were in that space, right? And the art handlers opened it up. We didn't know really what we were going to say, what we were going to see or experience. A scan can never come close, And in fact, those coxcomb screens, I had found that a tiny little scan in an ancient exhibition catalog. And I said, Takaaki, what are those? And they brought them out. And I said, this, just to end it on a joke, show you how Kasamatsu-san and I work together. I saw those screens and those colors, and I said, you're a dead man, Van Gogh. And he said, isn't he already dead? So that's kind of how we work together. To me, anyway, that's how we work together. And it was a visceral experience of the time that we shared in the presence of those screens, and wanting to share with the audience what that feels like, what that felt like.
Sounds like filmmaking heaven. Katherine?
Well, yeah, Linda, your discussion of finding these tiny scans in a book and then being able to see the real deal reminds me that you've not only created this fabulous film, but you've created an invaluable educational online resource. So could you talk a little bit about this online resource before we close out this evening?
I was able to get an educational grant from the Japan Foundation, and together with professional educators and art educators, we were able to develop 4 educational modules with a lot of resources, including there's a glossary of 150 Edo art-related terms with pronunciation guides, because many people are afraid to pronounce even the word Edo, right? It's not Edo, it's Edo. And all these amazing lesson plans for elementary, junior high, and high school, along with links to all of the museum collections that I researched online, books for additional reading. And I really hope that you'll take advantage of the website. You can order the DVD, whether for yourself or for your high school or your college or university or library. And I hope that if you just if you're interested in ordering a DVD, you can just click on order the DVD. So I hope you'll take advantage of these educational resources, which one of the teachers who developed the resource showed us an artwork inspired by one of the carp from the film and a lotus leaf. And this 8th grader had created a 3D mobile patterned on the art from the film. And he said, the most important thing to me was that the viewer can make up their own story. It doesn't matter whether the fish is real or whether the fish is made up or where it's swimming. Is it a lake? I want the viewer to come up with their own story. And I said, you're ready to teach a film workshop. So if that's the kind of projects that these educational modules and the film are inspiring, I really hope that people will take advantage of them.
That's so wonderful. It's really already having a life beyond the film. So edoavantgarde.com is the website, everyone. So we only have a couple minutes left, so I'd just like to wrap up by thanking you, Linda and Yukio, very much for this enjoyable conversation and for sharing so many insights with us this evening. We really appreciate your being here. I'd also like to thank our DIA colleagues, Emily Boyer and Larry Baranski, who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure everything ran smoothly for our live online event tonight. And of course, from the Freer House, our thanks go especially to William Colburn and Ryan Cunningham, who coordinated numerous details for the event. And in fact, it was William who first proposed bringing Edo Avant-Garde to our Detroit audiences, and it's thanks to his initiative that we're all gathered here online tonight. And last but not least, thanks to Freer House and the DIA's Friends of Asian Arts and Cultures and Friends of the Detroit Film Theater for their support of this program. So thanks, everybody. We wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.